Good morning, everyone. I'm Nina Chennai, and I'm a non-resident fellow here at AEI. And Josh Meltzer, senior fellow at Brookings, and I are pleased to welcome you all and our distinguished panelists today to an AEI-Brookings program on outbound investment. This program is part of a joint bipartisan AEI-Brookings project entitled Reconceptualizing Globalization that Josh and I have led for several years. And this project seeks to bring innovative thinking to improve the understanding and importance of international trade and investment, as well as the impacts of globalization. We have today with us three distinguished panelists, whom Josh will introduce, to have this timely and important discussion. So first, a bit about the issue. The US has prided itself on its openness to trade and investment in the post-World War II period. And this openness has been critical to US engagement, US power, and even US national security over the years. And there has been a change of late, just due to geopolitical circumstances, in terms of thinking and what direction the US may need to take to grapple with the most important foreign policy issues of the day. And so there's been a shift in thinking in some circles with respect to how outbound investment may need to be regulated for national security purposes. And it's not any investment. The focus of this investment is China. Now, concern over outbound investment generally has focused on three areas: transferring technology, capabilities, capital. And there are various existing policy tools that the US has in its tool chest to address these issues, but proponents of increased regulation believe they are insufficient. Think tools like export controls, sanctions. And interestingly enough, this issue brings together unlikely political bedfellows, so to speak, and doesn't split along party lines. As a side note, this is one of the few issues that, for example, Representative Rosa DeLauro and Senator John Cornyn, as well as the Biden administration, agree on at some level and can collaborate on. They take different views. For example, Jake Sullivan has said in a recent speech, we're also enhancing the screening of foreign investments in critical areas relevant to national security. And we're making progress in addressing outbound investments in sensitive technologies with a core national security nexus. On the other side, we have House Financial Services Committee Chairman Patrick McHenry recently saying, quote, "For the US to compete with China, we cannot become more like the Chinese Communist Party," noting concerns over heavy-handed government regulation in this space. So in other words, the views on this issue are truly cross-cutting. Now, the US has had a regime in place to review certain types of inbound investment into the US since the 1970s, and this is known as the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS. So we're going to set CFIUS aside for a moment. The outbound investment proposals, however, have had their genesis prior to the pandemic. So Senators John Cornyn and Bob Casey were proponents of creating this so-called reverse CFIUS for outbound investment during the 2018 efforts to reform CFIUS. Now, at that time, Cornyn indicated in Senate testimony back in 2018 that China has, quote unquote, weaponized investment to, quote unquote, vacuum up US industrial capabilities from American companies that focus on dual-use technologies, close quote. The efforts were ultimately unsuccessful and morphed into trying to address these concerns raised in the context of US export controls. Now, the issue continued to simmer with all of the supply chain disruptions during COVID-19, which raised concerns about the footprint of key industries. Now, tied with this, there were concerns on Capitol Hill that export control reforms that had come out of the CFIUS reform proposals, known as FIRMA, had been insufficient and not actually satisfied those concerns that US actors were still creating capacity in China in industries of national security concern. Now, since 2021, the question of how and whether to regulate US outbound investment has been on again, off again, with several pieces of legislation that have been under active consideration, and then with the Biden administration that has voiced support for certain congressional efforts along the way, but has also indicated that it may move forward with an executive order with its own approach, and maybe even imminently. But there are a number of proposed approaches to this issue, and the details on this really do matter. From creating processes which would allow a US government interagency committee to block certain majority-minority investments, joint ventures, other types of arrangements with Chinese companies, or put conditions on those investments, to notification requirements, which would focus on transparency, from regulating broadly all investments to China, to more narrow lists of specific industries like semiconductors or supercomputing or AI, and from relying on national security concerns to cloak industrial policy considerations in determining which investments are permissible and which ones are not. And there isn't necessarily any consensus, again, on that has emerged on a path forward. Now, that won't necessarily prevent action in this space, but there isn't across-the-board alignment on how to achieve objectives if we can also agree on objectives. Again, the proposals have had the facial purpose of targeting investments to China, but potentially have a whole slew of intended and unintended consequences. Now, I have to caveat everything today, that everything we're going to do here is going to be a lot of prognostications on the what if. From what we've looked at the news, we don't believe anything has been announced on this issue, even up to the start of this program. We've seen a lot of smoke on this issue, but sort of actual limited fire. And the purpose of this program is to have a robust dialogue to help flesh out the what if things do proceed and play out, and the resulting policy considerations. So before I turn to Josh to introduce our panelists and kick off what we hope will be a really vibrant discussion this morning, I wanted to just a quick piece of housekeeping. We're pleased to have an in-person audience here. Thank you all for coming. And we also have a number of online viewers for this program. So for those in the room, we will start taking questions later on in the program, and there'll be a mic that will come around to you. So please raise your hand, and we will switch to Q&A at the 10:40 mark. And for those of you online, please email Katrina Fee, that's Catriona.fee@aei.org, or submit via Twitter at #AskAEIEcon. So next to you, Josh.
Great, thanks.
You.
Yeah, thanks, Nina. And so I'm just going to introduce the panelists, and then we'll get into the conversation. So just running down the line of panelists here, Clint Willems is partner international trade policy at the law firm Aitken Gump. Prior to that, he served in the Trump White House as Deputy Assistant to the President for International Economics, Deputy Director of the National Economic Council, and part of the National Security Council. He's also served as key negotiator with governments and other bodies, including China, the EU, the UK, Korea, Japan, and members of the G7, G20, and APEC. He's litigated a number of WTO disputes on behalf of the US and has significant congressional experience, including working as legislative director for former Rep. Paul Ryan and on the House Budget Committee. Scott is Senior Advisor and Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. He's a leading authority on Chinese economic policy. He's author of a number of books, including China's Risky Drive into New Energy Vehicles from 2018, The Fat Tech Dragon, benchmarking China's innovative drive from 2017, and others. He's also edited a number of important articles and books. From 2000 to 2014, he was professor at Indiana University, where he established the Research Center for Chinese Politics and Business. Elena Rybakov is a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute across the road. She's also non-resident fellow at Bruegel and a director of the International Affairs Program and vice president for foreign policy at the Kiev School of Economics. Her research focuses on global markets, economic statecraft, and economic sovereignty. She has over 15 years of experience with the financial markets, has held several very senior roles really, including Deputy Chief Economist at the Institute of International Finance in Washington, Managing Director and Head of Europe, Middle East and Africa at Deutsche Bank in London. She's also been an economist at the International Monetary Fund here as well. So depth of expertise on the panel. Thank you everyone for being here, and let's kick off the discussion. I think the first question is just to sort of level set, I think a little bit like where are we at, what is on the table in terms of proposals for outbound investment, and importantly, what are we trying to achieve with these proposals coming down the line? We'll just run down the line maybe. Clete, if you want to kick that off.
Sure, thank you for the question, and thanks for having me today. And I think before I say something super controversial, I just want to clarify I'm here in my personal capacity, not on behalf of Akin Gump or its clients. And I think this is a great way to start the conversation, because I do feel like the dialogue gets a little convoluted because there are lots of different ideas out there with lots of different objectives, both coming from the Hill as well as from the administration. And I think of it in terms of three main things that policymakers are trying to achieve. And I think where we need to start is to say, are those goals meritorious? And if they are, is outbound investment restrictions or screening the way to get at them? And the three things that I see are there's an interest in restrictions on capital flows to Chinese companies, especially military companies. There's an interest and concern about transfer of technology and know-how to some of those same companies. And then there is a concern about supply chain resilience more broadly. And where I come down is about 1.5 of these three, I think, should be addressed through outbound investments restrictions. And when you look at capital flows, I think you want to look at both an entity-based approach and a sectoral-based approach. And what the administration is looking at is some key sectors where they want to make sure that money is not being transferred to companies that are involved in developing Chinese military apparatus or are involved in cutting-edge technologies that have at their core a military foundation. And that is something that I think is not squarely within export controls. You could construct export rules theoretically that could get at it, but it really isn't the main thrust. Export control rules are more about the technology and the export of the actual product rather than the money. And so I think that's somewhere to look. In terms of the entity-based approach, there's legislation on the Hill. Andy Barr has been talking about ways to expand CMIC, the Chinese military-industrial complex rules. I think that's worth looking at. Then when you look at the transfer of the know-how, that's where I kind of have my half, right? Because you can get at some of this through export controls, and you want to explore that. But when you're talking about the kinds of things that private equity and venture capital firms are doing, maybe that isn't best dealt with through an export control regime, and we can sort of get into why or why not. And then finally, when it comes to supply chain resilience, that's where I really do side with folks like Patrick McHenry, where I don't think the role of the US government is to intervene in every single supply chain decision a company is going to make abroad and tell them what they can and cannot do. I think if we have concerns about supply chain resilience and over-reliance on China, there's better ways to get at this. One way, in my opinion, would be doing trade agreements where we're linking supply chains with with partners and allies and helping diversify away from China. And then I would also look at our own house and what can we be doing domestically on the tax and regulatory front to incentivize businesses to have more supply chains in the US rather than in China. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that's helpful in terms of level setting and the way that I think about it, and maybe can frame some of this discussion.
Okay.
Well, good morning, and thank you for inviting me. I am not a lawyer. I've not worked in the Trump administration or elsewhere. I am a scholar at CSIS, and I always can only represent myself. No one wants me to be associated with them anyway. So, but what I follow Chinese industrial policy, technology innovation in general, and U.S.-China relations, so I can speak from that perspective. And I think the discussion around investment restrictions is about a broader conversation that the US and the rest of the world are having about whether we ought to change the fundamental rules of the game of the global economy. The fundamental rules of the global economy where essentially we have commerce, trade, investment, travel, et cetera, which generally we permit, but only in very discrete, specific circumstances do we place restrictions on those for national security reasons. Now we're having a discussion about whether actually we ought to more broadly condition commercial activity because of the national security risks that we face from a normal type of relationship with China. And that is a conversation that's going to take a while. We've gone through, we're much further along in that conversation in terms of export controls, and we had the 2018 revisions to our laws, and that has changed things quite a bit. And as Nina said, we are somewhere less further down the road, but closer in making reforms with regard to investment. I'm glad that we're having this conversation because I think we've flipped relatively quickly between 2015 to 2017 in some policies, particularly with regard to tariffs, without the kind of full-scale, robust, long conversation that we're having right now. So I think this is actually progress in terms of how Washington works and thinking about these, and that it is taking a long time for me is a good thing, not a bad thing, because we're really talking about fundamentally changing the way the world works. I'm not going to, at the beginning, say exactly where I come down on any particular policy, but just to say this is a big, giant challenge, and it's not an easy one. U.S. investment in China is roughly has been somewhere between 5 and 10 billion a year, going back the last couple decades. That has been about 3% of total foreign investment into China. And last year was about 0.6% of all investment in China. Because China has spent 57 trillion on fixed asset investment last year. So we're talking about regulating a very small portion of total investment. So I think we need to, whatever we do, engage this topic with a lot of humility, because our ability, the leverage that we have is a small little portion of overall commercial activity, and we want to get this right. When we're done with this, we want to make sure we did more good than harm, and that we actually did something rather than just did something in Washington that lets us go home and say we accomplished something. So I think there's a lot to do.
Thank you. I will just carry over from my colleagues, which is sort of a fantastic setting. So we talk about national security economic statecraft now as a multidisciplinary endeavor, and this is exactly what my colleagues mentioned. We used to think in the 2000s and sometime later that economics can be to the side and we can have free enterprise, we can have sort of free flow, capital flows with just very small limits. Now we're thinking about national security, foreign policy, and economics and defense all together. So this is now part of the same sort of complex. We talk about it, we write about it, we read what Jack Sullivan sort of puts out, but at the same time, we don't have robust models which tell us this is the objectives, these are the targets, these are the tools, this is how it works. So when we use a certain measure, whether it be export controls or sanctions and now outbound investment, we unfortunately don't have any frameworks. You know, those of you who remember economics and Greenspan, in the early days of inflation targeting, we all were looking as like, is it ambiguity? Is it constructive or destructive? And we were not quite sure, what is he saying? You know, what does he mean? And then eventually we decided on some sort of framework on the inflation targeting. Then we messed up with QE and others, but at least there was some sort of framework. At the moment, we're trying to do the same with this sort of big national security, or rather economic sovereignty, without actually having any model or framework. And I think that's the first thing that we need to think about. The second thing I want to make a point about is, one thing is the policy design, another thing is enforcement and implementation and enforcement. So if, for example, we decide that, you know, sales tax of X, you know, 20% or something is wonderful policy, fine, we do it. But then if there are no cash registers, as if we don't explain to enterprises what are the forms they're supposed to fill out, it's never going to work. And then people will come back and say, is this policy working? Well, policy might be working, we just haven't tried to implement it. So my worry about this specific instrument is that given that the enterprises are the frontline implementer of any government policy, they're sort of the front line of defense, we need to give them manageable, administratively possible tools to be able to execute that. So if they will be forced to be reporting and implementing the policy of the government, because they are sort of extended arm of implementation of this policy, we need to think carefully about that design. And sometimes in export controls it's already not working, sometimes in inbound investment it's not working. So as my colleagues said here, it's very important that we spend longer time trying to work with the industry to make sure that this administrative capacity is there. And we can talk more about it during the panel.
Great, thank you. I think that's a fantastic level set, and there's a lot on the table, so let's open some of those doors. I want to pick up, I think, on, like, this is sort of a question to all the panelists, but one of the things you sort of picked up on is the approach to addressing capital flows, as this is an appropriate tool for that. And Scott, I think you made the point, which indirectly, I think, in that. Okay, so we can address capital flows, but it's a pretty minor part of what's going on in terms of investment into China. So I think my question is, what are we seeking to achieve here? So even if we kind of restrict capital flows into China, in terms of actually achieving some of the goals that you have laid out, right, in terms of the capacity to sort of build this technology and so on and so forth, it seems on its face it's going to be pretty limited irrespective. So how does this approach then achieve those goals? What else do we need if we actually are going to have an effective policy here?
Well, I guess I can start on that and say, as I understand the concern that is generally expressed by those in the national security apparatus. It is about American investors putting capital into companies that are affiliated with Chinese military. And that is what underpinned the executive order on Chinese military industrial companies under the Trump administration, which was then carried forward by the Biden administration, where they targeted some very individual specific companies and said, look, they're affiliated with China's military. We shouldn't allow Americans to put money into that. And I think that is a totally sensible, reasonable national security policy. My concern with CMIC is that it's too narrow. And as it is currently drafted, it only deals with publicly traded securities. So you can put private money, you can do debt, all kinds of financing to those same companies, and you're not caught up by the law. There's also sort of a question of, is it applying to parents and subs and everything like that? And so I think one very surgical step forward that we could take would be to say, okay, we've identified these companies and said, no publicly traded securities, let's extend that to other kinds of financing. Now, in terms of the volume of money, I don't think this is revolutionary, but it's sensible, right? And those are the kinds of incremental steps forward you could take in that space.
Anyone else want to?
Go ahead.
Well, I would just say that there's roughly two kinds of proposals. One is about transparency and reporting and notification, and others are, I guess, targeted to certain kinds of industries or certain kinds of specific kinds of entities. Generally speaking, I think the idea of notification in specific kinds of technologies is a liftable thing for a certain industry, getting to what Alina was saying at the beginning, that you had to, if companies have to implement this, we have to think of something that they can do. And there may be very specific technologies that you can identify, or specific institutions that we know are likely bad actors. If you've got to look at the range of bad actors, those are the most likely ones. But the precision is really critical. The more ambiguous this is, the harder it will be to implement, and the harder it will be to know whether it's working. So precision is really valuable. So I think what Cleet and the Trump administration started off doing in specific areas made a lot of sense. But if we just feel happy by creating a very large bureaucracy that tries to do everything, then I think we will get out over our skis and we will actually make things worse. Because we are in the competition that we have with China is both about restricting the transfer of technologies that could aid their military or intelligence, is also about us staying ahead, right, and keeping our advantages. And so we also have to make sure that our companies and other companies around the world want to invest and do business here and make sure that we continue to advance as best we possibly can. So we have to keep our eyes on both of those things at the exact same time.
And I will bring maybe multilateral cooperation into this, because I know we put CFIUS to the side, but at the time that CFIUS was sort of revamped in the US, first of all, it was one of the first sort of thought leadership examples on how to do it. If you think about other G7 countries or European countries, they didn't have anything similar to that. So in a way, US took the lead and also brought their partners with them. But the partners were willingly coming. And at the time of the passage, or shortly about, I think maybe 19, 20 countries already had some sort of investment screening controls at the time. So it was much easier for them than to move forward. Still, I personally think Europe is lagging US on CFIUS. But now we're talking about the outbound investment. I think of Taiwan, Korea, maybe a few other countries, but in Europe, I'm not aware of anybody having the same degree of discussion. I know von der Leyen made comments about it recently, but we don't have any systems. So if we jump too far forward without bringing our partners, then what's going to prevent companies from other countries doing investment into China, or maybe subsidiaries, of the US companies via other other jurisdictions going into China? So I think here multilateral support is extremely important, and I'm sure we'll discuss it more. One more sort of nudge I'm going to put into Scott's comments, which I perfectly agree with, but just to be provocative, we do have emerging technologies. We have technologies like broader AI. What do we do with that?
Well, you all have raised so many interesting issues, so we will try over the course of our time to dig into them a little bit more. I actually want to pick up on Scott's comments and dig a little bit more into the objectives that are trying to be achieved through this policy. We hear a lot about national security framings. We hear a lot about China. When we look at the text of, say, some of the legislation that's out there, or even the proposals or how they're being reported that the administration is considering, there are broader issues that are trying to be addressed, right? Scott, and you mentioned that. When I'm looking at the first section, factors to be considered in the latest legislation that was introduced by Rosa DeLauro in the House, it says, the economic, intelligence, military, health, or agricultural interests of the United States. And there are another 5 elements. There's another entire section on supply chain sensitivities. So the question is, what are we actually trying to achieve here?
Yeah. I think, as Cleet suggests, we're trying to achieve everything. It sounds like in some of these pieces of legislation. And that's why we need a conversation, and hopefully we get to something that's more tailored. Broadly, that type of concern that is expressed in the early part of the legislation suggests that the relationship that we have with China and the rest of the world has with China is simply a pile of risks. It's supply chain risks, national security risks, it's human rights risks. And though that is all true, but there's also advantages that come from that relationship. The relationship is not only about making money and making things more efficient. So if you for example, just think about a company like Intel, which started investing in China in the late 80s, early 90s, with chip production there. And under the current conversation where you're talking, we would think that would be totally wacko for the US to permit the world's leading chip designer and manufacturer to invest in China, because it leads to the diffusion of technology, China's own capabilities, which would then translate into the military. But one of the things, and I'm not trying to defend Intel specifically, but just people are familiar with the company, and they've been in China a long time, is that by investing in China, yes, they help China along, but they help China along inside Intel's architecture, inside an innovation network led by Intel and by Western companies. And so if part of our goal of thinking about our relationship with China is maintaining our advantages, part of the way we do that is by having Chinese inside our ecosystems. A cruder way to describe that is we want them addicted to our technology as long as possible, right? Without giving away the store.
If I can jump in on this, because on the DeLauro bill, again, this is one of those examples of something where I think we shouldn't be trying to create an outbound regime to address that problem. Because the bill on the Hill that DeLauro has introduced, and it's sort of the successor to Casey Cornyn from last Congress, really is about supply chain, as you articulated it. I mean, this bill is massive, right? It creates a whole new government apparatus to review almost every investment into China, and it's defined to include all these different sectors, but then it also applies to any company with major procurement contracts from the United States. That company will then have to turn around and get permission from the US government to make an investment in China. I mean, that's crazy, in my opinion. It's really going well beyond what I think is necessary. But I think it's really important for this audience to distinguish that kind of approach from the thing that I was talking about earlier, which was, we know this company is affiliated with China's military, let's cut off financing there, or what the administration is looking at. Now, the way the administration talks about its EO, which we're going to see any day now, it's been imminent for about 8 months, the way they talk about their EO is to say they want to deal with the gaps in the existing architecture, and in particular the export control system, where there's a scenario where we've made a determination that we can't send technology, certain technology, to Chinese entities because it's too sensitive. We need to make sure that we don't have our companies, our PE and our VC firms, financing the development of that same exact technology. And so it really is a question of, is the export control system in and of itself broad enough, or is there something we need to do on top of that that's additive, that deals with these national security threats? And again, I think that is an area worth exploring, and great minds can differ on whether you do it by adding provisions to the export control system versus whether you have this new EO, but it's a totally different objective than what DeLauro and others are trying to achieve. And I would just ask everyone to really draw those distinctions as you're talking about it, because it's easy to sort of get caught up in like all this different stuff that people call outbound investment screening, and some of it makes sense and some of it probably doesn't.
Can I just add one little thing? I think if we use an analogy, the needle in the haystack, right? Some of these proposals are, let's look at the whole haystack and hopefully we'll find those needles. Probably a bad idea. Instead, hey, we've identified the needles, don't invest in those needles.
Yeah.
That's the easier, more specific way. Because if you ask everyone just to sift through everything, you will waste a lot of time and energy and make things worse.
And maybe I'll add here also, because there are two different trends happening at the same time. And as you pointed out very well, we're trying to fill the gaps. So we have the end user, end use, we have specific technologies, and then we're trying to add to it investment with technology transfer. So this is one aspect of cleaning up the system and making it more consistent. But at the same time, we have the parallel trend with the CHIPS Act with changing the scope. And I think that's what sort of jumbles up this whole conversation. We haven't quite decided on the scope, and it seems to be an ongoing conversation, where sort of specific military use in China versus undermining Chinese ability to develop more advanced technology, or sort of limiting, increasing the gap between us and them. And I think that's what makes this sort of decisions so complicated, and they still haven't managed to come up with anything specific, even the reporting standards.
Yeah, it'd be helpful to, I think, for the audience and for the conversation, maybe just to articulate a little bit more the ways that US investment into China and just generally happens, because we're focused on capital flows, and I think you can sort of imagine this simply as sort of a passive investment where you've got a stake, whether in equity and debt, and the company's doing its thing irrespective, and then you might just ask the question, well, you zero out the US contribution, but they'll get it from somewhere and so forth. But there's obviously other ways that US investment can transfer technology and know-how into China, and that's I think really sharpens the conversation around, well, what is happening there that export controls can't address? So that's the gap issue, and where do we maybe go beyond some of the sectors or companies that export controls maybe are not addressing? So I don't know if any of you want to sort of expand a little on the various ways that US investment into China might create problems from a national security perspective beyond just that passive investment piece.
Well, I can give a little bit on terms of the numbers because it's really like a funnel or a pyramid, and we've got roughly somewhere between $3.5 to $4 trillion financial relationship with China, right? Most of that is in treasuries, so that's as passive as you can get, I suppose. Then beyond that, we have Chinese firms listed in the United States, about 250 Chinese firms listed. and then we have U.S. firms who have invested in China through indexes or directly, and that's a few $1 trillion. Then you've got direct investment, which I think American companies in China as subsidiaries or in joint ventures, and there you're talking somewhere around $125 billion cumulatively in that. In terms of venture capital, which is where people are worried about certain types of tech, you're talking much smaller numbers, probably around 2 to 3 billion per year, and a few hundred deals per year, right? So it's a small subset. The question is, so trying to regulate that top funnel, at the very top, that will be very hard, and that's basically blanketing and saying, the relationship overall is problematic, and we just don't want to encourage China's economic development, and that is the risk, as opposed to going to the other end of the pipeline and saying there's these specific technologies that we're worried about venture capital firms investing in, or private equity or whatever, and focusing on those targets. And my sense is that for the type of outward investment or reverse CFIUS, it's those few hundred cases that people ought to be paying attention to, and probably of those few hundred cases, it's probably like a couple dozen that really might matter. So so we have to figure out how to build a fleet bureaucratic system. That's an oxymoron. To deal with a few dozen cases, right? That is the challenge. It's not undoable, but it is the challenge.
Let me give you a specific example of what I think the administration is focused on that isn't covered by export controls, right? So let's take a emerging technology. I mean, something totally novel in AI or quantum. I think those are sort of less defined at this point in time than semis certainly is. So you have a startup in China who says they want to be the next quantum or AI giant. And a US fund says, all right, I think that they've got a good team, they've got some good ideas. I want to go make an investment in them. I'm going to take a stake in the company. I'm going to get some board seats. I'm going to consult, and I'm going to really just make sure that my investment is the best. And these guys are the AI champion of the world, or they're the quantum champion of the world. That's what they're worried about. And that's something, because the technology is not yet established, we don't have an export control on it. And so you have a scenario where you have a US firm going in, trying to take its investment, make it work, and create this new emerging technology in an area where the US government believes that this is going to be foundational to our ability to wage war and really to have the most advanced economy moving forward. So again, I'm not here speaking for Akin Gum's clients nor the administration, but if they were here, I think that's what they would articulate as one of the key things that they're concerned that they don't think they can do through export controls.
And if I can jump in, exactly, this is an example where we have, again, the definition of scope rather than cleaning up, because the export controls would also have to be cleaned up on the emerging technology, right? So there are some areas where we might have export control in a good, but we still can go and invest directly into China. And that definitely has to be, that loophole has to be closed already. In addition to that, we do have this emerging technology where even CFIUS is not fully done, export controls are not fully done. And if we think about AI, or this new scope, emerging technology new scope, we shouldn't just go always for outbound investment. For example, what do you need for AI? You need chips, you need data, you need sort of smart scientists, right? And on the data front, maybe we should have data privacy laws, because we can transfer some of our data onwards to China, just because also there is no such, we're worried about TikTok, right? But we don't have regulation here to protect our own data. So why CFIUS or outbound investment should be the data privacy implementers? That's completely out of place. So I think, again, it has to fit into the bigger picture.
You make a great point, though, about the need for us to get our house in order here as well. I think that's often lost. And I was watching sorry to riff for a second, but watching the China committee hearing last night, there was all this discussion of all the defensive tools that we're going to take to deal with the issue of China. But a big part of that also has to be to get our house in order here. And you mentioned a data privacy regime would be a nice place to start.
Well, should we shift to, what is China going to do if something like this moves forward in the United States? And what could we see on that front?
It's really interesting having, I was in China in the fall, meeting with, and I met with Chinese venture firms and tech companies, and I was there on October 7th, which was an interesting day to be in China. Certainly lots of complaints and accusations, pretty radical, hyperbolic. And then the question was, well, how are they going to respond to those kinds of restrictions? And so far, we've not seen that other shoe drop, right? China has retaliated on diplomatic things. We kick out journalists, they kick out journalists. We close a consulate, they close a consulate. On the tech restrictions, they have not, because they need our technology. They need our markets. They need our know-how. I don't think they need our money as much, except when it's really smart money that helps them delineate between different types of technologies or gives them the reputational benefits that then give them access to additional technology or markets. But they've not retaliated because they are the ones that are chasing us in most of these technology areas, and they don't want decoupling. They don't want to further that along. But so that's been their initial response. I think actually over the last several weeks, we're beginning to wonder whether the Chinese think just sitting on their hands is actually encouraging us to go faster with some of these restrictions and that they need to start imposing costs. So we've seen the Chinese start to do some investigations into some due diligence firms, look into some Chinese foreign companies in China, hint that they sort of open their jacket and say, remember, we've got these things that we could do. We have an unreliable entities list. We've got a counter-espionage law to try and slow us down. So the next question is, will they go further? Would they, China already restricts investment inward and outward. Would they make things more difficult for us? I think that's quite possible. And in some areas we might think it really won't matter, or we'd be happy. It would actually help us achieve some of these goals. But in certain areas where the Chinese are making a lot of progress and could be helpful to us, it could be problematic. So in electric vehicles, right? The Chinese are at a minimum peer competitors across every part of the electric vehicle supply chain, from the minerals to the cars, and the batteries, all the components of the batteries. And so if right now, I guess recently, I think it was announced, Ford has been in conversations and I guess a deal with CATL to license some of their battery technology to produce batteries in Detroit, which would go into Ford vehicles. I would expect if we go forward with this, we might see China start to block deals like that, or review or step in further into global M&A review deals, which they have done. So I do think that we have to be aware that if what we establish isn't really based on sound logic and sound laws and implementable, we will get blowback from Chinese retaliation, which won't. And then we will be in a spiral, and others in Europe, others will be competing. So I think it's really important that we, because of the likelihood of Chinese retaliation, that we are as clear and principled about this as absolutely possible.
And can I jump in? I think it's even equally important that we're clear and principled in front of our partners and allies. Because the best thing that China can do in response is then shift away from the US and offer deals to somebody else in order to try to break up the coalition. And we don't have the absolute advantage, neither in technologies, and actually, I don't know which exceptions, but we generally probably don't anymore, not in the 60s, we're not in the 60s and 70s anymore, or just the capital flows. So the best thing that China can do is go to our partners. And if our partners feel that we are making decisions not on a principled and sound legal basis, then they will say, well, why should we go with you? It is potentially dangerous for us. It's an industrial policy. It not only potentially hurts our producers, but also our consumers. So we're not there with you. We need to evaluate costs and benefits of these decisions.
So I have a little bit of a different take on it. I agree with some things, and I might have a different view on others. I think from a broad standpoint, I think the Chinese retaliation will be somewhat limited. And I think you got to look at their economy right now. They're not in a great spot, right? And so if you already have companies looking at de-risking, reevaluating their Chinese investments. They're concerned about the anti-espionage law. They're concerned about the tech crackdown. And for China to then just go harder after U.S. companies in the middle of that, I think that would hurt their economy a tremendous amount. And I think they're going to think twice about it. I'd also say, on top of that, I mean, and Scott alluded to this, China's usual playbook is reciprocity. And so we do something and they do something in return. But here they already restrict all this kind of investment into the US, right? So they already have the government helping make these decisions. So it's not like they would have to do much more. And then the next point I'd make is I think if you're looking at this from what are their likely responses, I mean, I think it's going to be rhetorical. And then on the decoupling point, I actually disagree. I think China is trying to decouple from the US, but they want to do it on their terms. They phrase it a different way. For them, it is reducing reliance on US technology because they've seen what's happened with Huawei, they've seen what's happened with October 7th, and they don't want to be in that position anymore. So I think for them, it's how do they slowly decouple from the United States in a way that they can control and build up their indigenous innovation in the meantime. So again, I agree with a lot of what Scott said, but maybe a slightly different spin on it. And the last part I'll say, because I just can't help myself, because I think my party's getting this one wrong. And that's this question of Chinese companies investing and sharing technology in the United States where they're ahead of us. And you look at this Ford investment, and here's how I'm going to put it. For years, we've been making investments in China, and they've been taking our stuff. They've been taking our technology. I want to get some back. Yeah. So if we got a scenario where cattle has more advanced technology than we do, bring it in and let's get it for some U.S. companies. And I just think we're kind of looking at that one a little bit too narrow. I think that maybe we can. I don't want to learn all the lessons from China. I agree with McHenry again. Let's not become China to beat China. But maybe there are elements of their playbook that we need to be thinking about implementing ourselves, and that's one of them.
I don't want to pick up, I mean, Elena, you've made the point a couple of times now about the importance of allies and bringing them on board. And I think that was clearly important with respect to export restrictions. And we've seen actually quite a lot of progress, I think, across Europe and Japan and elsewhere. I think probably more than people originally expected. How, you made the point, I think it's right, that Europe is significantly behind the US in terms of even having this conversation, and there are other key allies and countries that really you need on board, I think. So how important is key allies and other markets adopting similar approaches needed in order for this to be effective, and where are we at in that respect?
Well, I think sort of it has advantages and disadvantages being the first. So the obvious advantage is that you set the agenda. If you're the one who already thought through the standards, discussed it with your industry, with the stakeholders, then you're in much better position than for others to implement your framework, right? And then, of course, you have a natural advantage. Of course, the disadvantage is that maybe your partners are not ready to come along. I do think it's absolutely critical. No matter what technology we look at, it's rare. It's almost impossible to find a technology where the US would have an absolute advantage, where our partners are not catching up soon enough, or potentially even China in some places. So for that, we do need to have the allies. And then if you look at the export controls, and I'll give you a specific example of Russia export controls that we're doing now, is even where we do have an advantage, there is a big problem of on shipment. Of course, China is a big problem, but then also other countries is a big problem. If they don't participate, you're done. So basically what happens is that somebody buys what we produce and happily on ship it to the target or end user or use that we would not like to see. So it matters for the policy, it matters for the implementation. So export controls, indeed, because of the war in Europe, Europeans suddenly changed almost completely their take on export controls, and they came in with the US. And here it also allowed the US not to go back to this very contentious issue of secondary sanctions with Europeans. Much better to bring them in rather than threaten them with the secondary sanctions, sort of makes it for a much better, happy alliance. So this is one example. On the inbound CFIUS, again, they were ready. I do still think they're behind. And the big problem there is each member state has to implement their own. And there is only sort of central reporting, but no central enforcement. On the outbound investment, we don't have anything yet. So I do worry that we're a little bit too far ahead without building the broader coalition. And if we don't build a broader coalition, then we'll give advantage away from our firms to somebody else, or we'll give advantage to less scrupulous firms that will use their foreign jurisdictions subsidiaries by doing the same thing. And then basically we'll disadvantage the sort of the better behaved firms versus others. Yeah, I see you would like to jump in. Please do.
I want to jump in on this. I do. And let me start with sort of where I think the allies are, and then I want to get to your point about implications of multilateral coordination on this versus export controls, because I think there's a distinction. So first point is where the allies are. I mean, I've been pretty encouraged with what I've seen out of Europe, and you've had von der Leyen and Dombrovskis with fairly forward-leaning statements. I'm optimistic that something will come out of the G7. I mean, it's not going to be groundbreaking. We're all going to do this exact same thing tomorrow, but it's saying there is a need to limit technology transfers to countries of concern, or whatever the language, the code we use for China in this particular instance. So I think they can get there, and I think that it's going to be a while before anyone implements it. And that's the reason I advocate for sort of incremental, go slow approach, right? I mean, I think this idea that the administration wants to have a pilot program with notifications and really only a limited amount of prohibitions, that's a good start. And I think something like that, while we continue to work on the allies, is important. Now, I think part of the reason people always ask, when's Outbound going to come out? When's the EO going to come out? I think part of the reason it hasn't come out so far is because the administration is, to a certain extent, learned its lesson from October 7th, right? They got a lot of criticism for not fully coordinating with the Dutch and the Japanese before they did that rule. And I think it was deserved criticism. But here's where I draw my distinction, right? Because I think there's a little bit of a difference in terms of the harm to the US economy as a result of being multilateral on something like export controls versus outbound investments. And so on export controls, you look at it and you say the US companies who were affected by this rule, they get like 30% of their revenue from selling into China. That money comes back here, it funds our innovation, and it's great for our economy, right? And I look at it like the more that we can have China subsidize our innovation, the better, right? And if they pull out because of these rules that only apply to them and they don't apply to the Dutch and the Japanese, basically everyone's just going to backfill. They're going to get the revenue to innovate. We're not going to have slowed down China's innovation. And that's a big problem. Now on investment, I'm not sure, number one, that the international landscape is the same, and there are sort of the private equity firms, venture capital firms around the world who do the same things as the American firms. Now there may be some of that in Europe, but I don't think it's quite as ubiquitous globally. I would also say, though, think about the harm to the US, right? So if we make a mistake on export controls, we harm our innovation and our technology leadership. If we make a mistake on investments, our big firms make less money and maybe their investors make a little less money. So it's a different cost calculus. I want our firms to make as much money as possible. It's great for the American economy. I know the AEI loves that, but it's different than saying we're totally undermining our innovation as an economy. We're instead saying our investors are going to make a little less. And I just think one is more important than the other. I have to say it, quite frankly. And so for me, yes, multilateralism is better, but I think it's a bigger deal when it comes to export controls and investment screening. And so I think we can afford, as long as we're incremental, to be a little bit more nose in front on this than we would be on export controls.
Yeah, I get that point in terms, if it's just the measure of, in the short term, the innovation trajectory. I still think if we go too far too fast, then we're likely to chill overall investment in our place in the global economy. For example, we want folks to continue to use the US dollar, right? And we're not talking about that right now, but we also want folks to put their money in our capital markets and a bunch of other things, whether it's with technology or not. And we still want to be the place to go, our currency, our markets. And so we want to make sure that we keep that overall advantage. And so the unintended consequences that are more difficult to measure, to me, it's just an empirical question. Let's go slowly. Let's try some pilots. Let's see what the consequences are. As Cleet said, I'm actually impressed by the increasing. There's gaps between the U.S. and its allies, but our analysis of China is very similar. Our language is increasingly similar. Our framing of the challenge is increasingly similar, and the trajectories of what we think we need are relatively similar. The Taiwanese and the Koreans are a little ahead of us actually on this. We're moving at some point. We never thought the EU would have an inbound investment screening system. Now they've got it. Now they're thinking about outward, and I think we're heading largely in the right direction. And so because of this is technology based, and different technologies have different companies with advantages and capabilities, we're going to have to follow what my colleague Matt Goodman calls variable geometry. This technology, these colleagues and countries that work together, that technology, these ones, which I think can be done. I think I just want to foot stomp this question of coordination. We need coordination inside our government better than we've got it right now. Right now, if you look, where is our expertise for this? It's in BIS, in commerce, mostly. And as fantastic as they are and capable, this needs to be someone above, right? So the National Security Council level. So we need an economic security secretariat that helps oversee all of these things. And I think that would make it so that we are strategic in our choices and planning. Cleet worked on the National Security Council, so he knows what a small institution that is, and it can draw on resources. But we need really a pilot agency that can look above everything and manage this.
Let me, I want to just drill into this a little further, but maybe from the perspective of compliance, which has also come up a couple of times in the panel, because Annalena, you made this point about good actors, bad actors, the various ways that you can circumvent a rule, and we've seen the challenges on the export control front through transshipment and so forth, and it's arguably a magnitude of order more difficult to know where investment flows are going, and particularly I think if you don't have partners on board. And so there's a perspective here which is in part you need partners on board, even if, Cleet, to your point, it's a little different in terms of the cost to US companies, but maybe more from a compliance perspective. And so I'd like to just get your perspectives on that, but also we can broaden that discussion out in terms of how are you thinking about the capacity? I mean, we've touched on this, but not directly, to actually do this effectively in a way which is more than hand-waving at the moment.
Well, I think it's a brilliant point, and here I agree with my colleagues, is that we need to have coordination domestically on all the tools of economic statecraft, and that's where we started the conversation. We need to have a broader framework. We all independent think tanks, we can also contribute to that framework, and I think the authorities are very receptive to us making a contribution, but it has to be some sort of high level enough, centralized authority that Scott has pointed out to. Otherwise, there's sometimes an impression, this tool seems to be working, we'll keep on smacking it. And it's not from the objective targets tools. No, it's because I have this tool. OFAC has a tool. It works. We have honed that tool. We're going to keep on using that. Now we have the new shiny tool. It's export controls. Let's see how that works. So that is not the best approach. It maybe is good in the firefighting approach, but it's not good as a medium-term strategy. So if you remember about the financial sector sanctions, it took us a decade to actually get banks fully on board, not because the banks didn't want to, but because they were not quite aware what know your client's client, what does it mean compliance, how you track transactions. Of course, now we also have much more help from AI in terms of tracking the relationship and transactions. We have SWIFT also helping us with some of that work. And it also took quite a few fines, In the beginning, there were, we sort of thought, as Panama paper shows, we've also done our sort of missing of some of these transactions. And then it maybe took almost 10 years for banks to fully digest, understand it. Okay, now this is how I work with the government. Now we're expecting the same level of compliance from insurance companies on the oil price cap, and also now from the tech companies. How are they supposed to do that? What kind of strategy from the government will be in terms of enforcement? Will it be like a risk-based supervision? Or will it be, I'll make a few examples and then you will figure out on your own? Will the industry organizations will have to lead that process? It's still not clear. And the reason it's also not clear is because we don't have like even a CFIUS-like thing within the Treasury, maybe that will coordinate everything. And just to give you an example from the export controls, if, for example, on the export controls we have the ECCN list, it doesn't correspond to the trade classifications. So if an independent researcher would like to look at the trade classifications and find out which items are under export controls, I don't have a way. If the State Department would like to do that, they don't have a way either. So we're all doing guesswork. And I understand it's very difficult technologically. The 10-digit classification on trade is not naturally suitable to the latest technologies, right? But at least maybe some sort of update on that and discussion with the industry about it, that would be helpful. Then as a bank, if I'm processing an invoice for some chips, does it say there on the invoice? Is there a requirement for me to see it? So then maybe a good actor will say, oh, no, I have doubts, and then the other actor will just say, oh, some chips, process my invoice. And then it could be that somebody will come to financial industry and say, wait a second, why did you process that? So I think we need much more detail on this technocratic, boring things, not the things you announce from the podium, of working with the industry, understanding what is needed. And I absolutely agree with that Europeans, that there are much more understatements from the policymakers are there. But we sometimes forget that each member state is responsible. So whatever problems we have here, they're having problems multiplied the number of the members. So in each country you have, is it foreign ministry coordinating? Is it the president's office coordinating? And then coordinating among themselves. And we have seen so far very uneven implementation of export controls. I think they're trying, but it's extremely uneven.
This is what I hope is one of the lessons from the October 7th rule, which is don't do an interim final rule with immediate effect if you don't know what's going to happen to industry. I mean, there was chaos in the semiconductor industry for at least a week and a half as they were trying to figure out, oh my gosh, I need a temporary license here and a temporary license there. And so what I'm hopeful is to facilitate compliance. And what we're hearing consistently from the administration is that they're going to do this, A, as a pilot program, but B, as proposed regs that will give people the opportunity for notice and comment so they could have absolutely clear definitions of what is prohibited, what's not prohibited, what you have to notice, what you don't have to notice. And that part, that industry feedback loop is so important so you get clarity so that people know what they're dealing with. And I think that's going to be really important in terms of compliance. The one question I think that is going to be challenging, and I'm not sure how they're going to resolve this, is going to be this jurisdictional question where you have multinational investment firms and things like that, and trying to define who does this rule apply to, what part of the entity does it apply to, and then on the other side of that, what if you have a Chinese parent with subs all over the world? Does it apply to the sub in Italy? Does it apply to the sub, in South America somewhere? And so that part of the compliance is going to be really tricky, I think, to deal with, and I'm not sure where they're going to come down on it, but hopefully we have a thorough public conversation about the best way to deal with some of these things.
Yeah. I was thinking about the challenge of a company just exporting a good to someplace around the world, and the differing tariff structures that we face, whether you're in agreement or not in agreement. And typically that makes it, there's advantages for very large companies who have compliance folks who can figure out the taxes and all the different regulations. And I think that is going to be a big challenge here. You look at larger firms, larger multinationals, they will be able to make sense of this. They have plenty of in-house lawyers. They can hire Aiken Gump and others and figure their way out through this. Smaller companies are going to have a much harder time. Universities, right, that have graduate students from China or elsewhere around the world working in their labs, that is going to be hard. And to identify the kinds of technologies that Cleet mentioned earlier, which was things that are in this space that aren't already prescribed, but could be. It's going to be those smaller companies, smaller venture firms, universities. That's where the education and outreach is going to be the most needed, and that's why we need to go step by step. I would say, though, let's make sure that we don't make perfect be the enemy of the good, right? I don't think the policy should simply be driven by the goal of chilling everything, and hopefully that vacuums up and covers enough. But I do think that if it is perfect precision that we're aiming for, we will never get there. And so that's why incrementally proceeding and interacting with those parts of our innovation ecosystem that will have the biggest challenges, but also potentially create the largest and most important innovations are where we're going to have to put a great deal of attention.
Absolutely. It's a fantastic point. And I think especially if with the outbound investment, we discussed earlier what kinds of investment, what kind of control or influence, but also if we also define it as type of investment that has accompanying technology transfer with it or knowledge transfer, then we could especially disadvantage smaller firms or universities where it's much more sort of a more blurred line between the physical investment and some sort of knowledge transfer.
Well, before we turn to audience questions, I wanted to sort of step back and ask sort of a really big picture question. So, do you all have any thoughts on what a step like this by the United States would mean structurally for the global investment frameworks and global capital flows? Scott, you've talked a bit about this in terms of potential chilling effects on investment, but any thoughts on, sort of any other bigger picture effects that policymakers may want to consider?
Well, I think there's two sides of this. One is actual investment activity, and the other is the global governance system. On activity, if we go too far too fast, what we will see is distortions in investment flows, because companies who have good legal counsel or just smart will hold back. They will be careful because they don't want to violate the law that's going to land them with a big fine or in jail and wreck the rest of their business. So I would expect to see in certain areas just simply a chilling if it's not clearly defined and we don't do all the things that Cleet and Elena said that we should. On the global governance side of things, the WTO barely speaks to this. Article 21 on national security, a couple paragraphs, basically says the members get to decide what they want to do. TPP, what's TPP? People remember this thing called TPP, which still exists, right? Really didn't cover this at all. We're venturing into totally new terrain here, and we will step by step need to come up with something that comes up with broader ground rules, because there are technology innovators on both sides of this strategic divide. And I know that reciprocity and the Chinese retaliation is something that we should worry about in the immediate future, because perhaps they need us more than them, or in the short term. But longer term, we do want to have a rules-based system, right? That rules-based system has been very beneficial for our economy, even for our national security. And so as we are engaging in these experiments, we ought to think what they look like when they get scaled up. So conversation this month at the G7 will be very principled and general. Next year it may be more precise and down the road. So we ought to think about making sure that we are in the early stages of building a sustainable architecture.
Yeah, I'll just say that it's unfortunate. I mean, I grew up as an economist sort of 30 years ago, and it sort of feels like another brick in the wall, the old song. So we might end up with the rules-based system of clubs, where people that, I don't want to repeat the French shoring and whatnot, but where there will be advantages and disadvantages of being in that club. We might not be able to resolve the issues with China around the WTO and technology immediately, but we are clearly on the path of expanding the scope of what is national security, what does it mean economic sovereignty, and I think the pendulum is still very much swinging in that direction before we can start coming back. And my colleague Adam Posen at Peterson, he wrote a wonderful article, of course we're all very much for free trade there across the street, is that we don't want to undermine our own industrial base by just going too far with that pendulum. So that worries me.
So I'm going to try not to too much take the bait on TPP, because I could go on for a while. But let me just say that as we're thinking about this comprehensive strategy versus China, we do need to have offensive things on offer to our allies. I can't tell you how many countries I hear from in the Indo-Pacific who say, you give us lectures, China gives us trade agreements and bridges. Where are we, right? Where is our trade agenda? So, Anyway, I won't go there now. Let me actually answer your question. So I think what are the implications? I mean, it really depends on what we do. And I think at where we started, and maybe we can sort of tie the bow on it and end where we started, it depends on what the actual measure is, right? I think if you do some of these things like the incremental approach pilot program that the administration is talking about, or you expand CMIC in an incremental way, I don't think that's earth-shattering. I think it will enhance things we're already doing. I do think we are on, as Elena put it, on this track towards two spheres in the world. I think we just have to acknowledge that. There is going to be some level of decoupling on technology and on financial flows that are related to that technology. I just think that's happening. So, I mean, I think that furthers us down that path. By contrast, if we go with the Deloro approach, I do think that is a game changer in terms of the way that we operate our government and the way that we view the private sector, in terms of the way that we interact with the private sector, that ultimately I think would be quite detrimental to the U.S. economy, to our economic strength and resiliency. And I do think that some of the goals that she's trying to achieve about supply chain resilience and diversification are better done through other means. And I guess I'll take the bait the second time and say, for example, TPP. You want to move supply chains away from China, get back in TPP and fix the rules of origin. That would be what I would do. I'd go to TPP, I'd change the rules of origin so you have less Chinese content. But I'll leave it there.
It cannot be all sticks. It has to be carrots to our industry, to stay here, and to our partners.
Yeah. And China is now, just to complete that sort of circle, China is the next in line to accede to the CPTPP. So
they are the next
watch that space.
Whose application is being reviewed, but there are others who are applying, and and they don't have to do it one at a time, right? It doesn't have to be they start China and then go to others. And TPP is increasingly going to be a misnomer, Trans-Pacific, because you have countries, including the UK and others from around the world applying. So they have to come up with a new name.
Yeah, a new name would be helpful, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
It would be helpful domestically as well.
Right.
I would love to do the Indo-Pacific supply chain agreement with all of the TPP countries.
Anyone? Let's find time for some audience Q&A. So if you got a question, I think, what's the protocol? Raise your hand.
Yes, please raise your hand.
Introduce yourself. There's people with microphones in the audience. Over here.
Hi, my name is Philip Gunn with the Washington Export Council. Thanks a lot for being here today. So my question is, does decoupling from or isolating China lead to potentially losing leverage with them and potentially raising the chances of confrontation of some sort? And if that is a risk, then how do we reduce it through this outbound screening mechanism? Do we make the needle?
He asked the easy questions.
Yes.
I want to take the first part, which I think is a little easier than the second part. Look, the more we delink our economy from China, the less theoretical leverage that we have. But I think if you talk to the Biden administration, their view is that we aren't going to change China, at least not under Xi Jinping, and therefore leverage is sort of a fleeting currency. We tried. Look, I was in the Trump administration. We thought 301 tariffs, we're going to go to the negotiating table, we're going to get them to change their behavior, and mixed results. Let's leave it at that. Now, in terms of, so the answer to your first question is definitely yes, it reduces our leverage, but leverage to what end would be the question I would ask you in return. The second point about does it increase the chance of conflict? I mean, I don't think outbound investment screening per se does, but I think every single person in this room and listening online should be worried about the trajectory that we're on, right? We need to figure out how to get some stability in this relationship so that it doesn't lead to conflict. And I think that increasingly we see each other's adversaries, and we do need to figure out where to maintain linkages between us to try to avoid that, so there's exchanges of ideas and to try to avoid that. And I wish I had all the answers on how we avoid conflict with China. I don't, but I think you're right to be worried about it.
Yeah. This question of leverage, relative dependencies, I think is a critical issue. I don't think the key to deciding whether you've got leverage or not is whether or not you stop war, right? There's lots of other things that are significant to measure. I do think 45 years of a commercial relationship with China being deeply embedded has changed their cost calculus on whether to provide lethal assistance to Russia and Ukraine, for example, because they know the secondary sanctions would crater their economy. And I think they also know that, I think that also changes the cost calculus on Taiwan, because what would happen in that kind of scenario would be absolutely devastating. And whether or not that would actually stop them, who knows? But the idea of leverage is about changing cost calculus. And so it's good that they have to do that math, right? And maybe they're bad at math and they decided, again, we don't care about that math, this is a sovereignty issue or some other thing, and they go for it and make some crazy choice. I think the other side of this is what I alluded to before. Our investments in interacting with the Chinese help us. It helps the Chinese, but it also helps us stay ahead, because typically they've been in our innovation ecosystems. Those are hierarchical, and those hierarchies are very difficult to change. In autos, the only reason that we've changed hierarchies is because of this breakthrough technology of electric propulsion, which has fundamentally changed the structure of the auto industry. It could happen in semiconductors if we have particularly very different new materials, or quantum instead of the traditional way that calculations occur. But there are those things. On the other hand, there are real national security risks from being too closely intertwined, because there are certain kinds of technologies which help their national security and their military in war fighting against us or others. And I think so we have to be able to walk and chew gum and dance and swim and multiple things all at the same time. So we can't lose sight of the value of kinds of the leverages and this competition over dependencies, while we're also trying to protect and hold back the technologies that we have that would make them better warfighters.
Maybe I'll jump in with that question. Is that it's fantastic that you mention it, because I think we need to be humble about what economic statecraft tools can achieve. And as Scott put it perfectly, it's changing cost calculus on specific decisions. We don't have any evidence of economic statecraft tools stopping the wars, deterring countries from invading, or changing regimes. As somebody early on in in this invasion of Ukraine said, well, those who are expecting regime change in Russia should jump into run Twitter and have a look what's happening there. So I think it's cost calculus, risk, cost-benefit analysis for very specific decisions. China is still on shipping a lot of our chips to Russia. That they're happy to do, appear to be happy to do. It's sort of at least what our research is showing. Maybe not on lethal, specific military goods. So this is where we can move the dial. But changing the regime or stopping the war, I think it's highly unlikely. One more comment is that I've been last year, this year, in so many war game sort of rooms on maximal response to China. I haven't seen any panel on engagement with China. Maybe it could be on green, maybe it could be specific sort of very narrow areas, but we also need to talk about some sort of engagement, because otherwise it seems both sides, and China of course uses it to their advantage in the propaganda, saying, well, we told you so. They would have done it anyway. We're just here on the receiving end of explaining, including maybe on the global financial and trade architecture about the WTO or maybe the Bretton Woods institutions.
Can I just add just a little bit to this? Sometimes there's other countries and regions around the world that are doing things a little bit ahead of us that are valuable, or thinking about things differently. The Taiwanese talk about strategic indispensability, chip manufacturing, as a strategic asset for them that raises China's cost calculus in terms of what they might do. Again, it's not going to stop it, but they've got to do that math, because 60% of chips get manufactured in Taiwan, 90% of advanced chips, and so if that goes offline, that is devastating for China. And so they are thinking there is some value economically and national security for Taiwan. At the same time, Taiwan has 25% of their tariff lines off limits to export to China, and they have a very advanced outward investment screening system vis-a-vis China. Anything over $50 million, you have to bring it to the Taiwanese authorities, and in certain types of technologies, everything needs to get reviewed. and they have just changed their laws regarding personnel and espionage. So you can have a deeply intertwined relationship for certain kinds of things, and you can also have significant defenses at the same time. So this is not an either-or choice that we have to make.
Can I also jump in here? You brought in, we also, just like on data privacy, we need to have intelligence community doing their job rather than expect companies to do their job. So that I think is also, we shouldn't outsource too many of government functions on the private sector rather than focus on more specific issues, like for example, Taiwanese outbound investment and then also different intelligence work. That should be ideally more separate.
Are there any other questions? Yeah. I also want to remind our online viewers, while you all are thinking of questions here, to please submit any questions through the email to Katrina Fee, that's katrina.fee@aei.org, or via Twitter, #AskAEIEcon.
So I want to I want to take advantage of picking up, while we don't have any further questions, on the trajectory of US-China relations, given the policy developments so far, and this sort of, I think, came out a little bit in some of the remarks just now, which is that I'm just going to throw out sort of two straw men to some extent to sort of set the scene. But are we headed? One could see this accumulation, and it's clearly not just driven by the US. I mean, I think it's really important to make the point that China is independently making its own decisions to decouple from the US, certainly on technology and other areas. But one could see this as a sort of a snowballing effect where we are sort of building up risks in the relationship, and that the trajectory looks, consistently bad going forward, and that it's unclear where this ends, putting aside war for the moment, but at least in terms of the economic picture. Or alternatively, are we in a sort of period where we are both rebalancing or de-risking? It looks maybe a little unlike that at the moment, but we will sort of get to a point where we've sort of essentially dealt with the areas that we consider problematic from a national security perspective, and there is a large area of trade which then can continue, and we sort of enter a new normal which is more stable maybe and less of a national security issue going forward. Where do you see that? I mean, there may be two sort of poles, and we're probably somewhere in between, but I'd like to get your views on that.
Yeah, I don't know if we know which one we're closer to at this point. I mean, I think we all know which one we prefer. I mean, I think what we need to be doing is designing policies so we get towards that second pole where there is, clear zones of no-go, clear zones of go. And if you're allowed to trade and do commerce with China in certain areas, we should be doing everything we can to promote that. On the other hand, if you can't go there, let's just, put the walls up and say this is no-go and be clear to industry. And I think that's important for all the reasons we've all been talking about in terms of providing stability both to business, helping continue to grow our economy, avoiding unintentional knock-on effects, and then hopefully promoting peace. But that does require, I think, responsible legislating and really thinking about these things in a strategic way. I think the administration, at least with its emphasis on dialogues, is going in the right direction, trying to make sure that they can pick up the phone and someone answers on the other side. And I do think someone mentioned it, at least looking for a positive agenda in some areas. Now, I think that's going to be limited for certain reasons. But if there are areas where we can actually work together and have exchanges with China, that's going to be critical too.
The U.S. policy towards China for much of the last half century was built on the premise that integrating China into the international order would tame China, would encourage the constructive parts of that society to develop, make it internationally more responsible, and that we'd be able to address common challenges, and also would lead to improvements in Chinese domestic political governance, not necessarily democratize or anything like that, but just make more humane domestic governance. I think we actually achieved a lot of that, but you can't predict future returns based on past performance. And under Xi Jinping, China has gone backwards on a lot of levels, domestically, internationally, it's very clear. And as far as I can tell, despite the fact that he drinks and smokes, he ain't going anywhere for a while, right? And so this is the China that we're going to need to deal with. And so the idea of a strategy built around integration that will emphasize responsibility and common interests, I think that we've decided that that's not going to work. That instead, what we have to do is figure out how to coexist with a very prickly system, right? But we have a commercial relationship in which we had this hug in the initial approach, and so we've got to figure out how do we reduce those areas of the relationship built around one type of system for the other, and they're doing the same thing. That's right. Yes. So how do we get back to the awkward hug and get us to a different place? Some days it feels like we are in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Right? We felt like that. Go back to August 1st last year. It felt like that. And as we get closer to Taiwan's elections, maybe we'll start to feel a little bit more like that. Other days it feels like, oh, this is potentially the early 1970s, and we're on the edge of détente or something like that. I don't know. Sometimes when I wake up in the morning, it feels like that. When I walk home at night, I feel like we're back in the crisis stage. And it would be nice if we could find some stable ground. I do think, broadly speaking, as Cleet said, the Chinese are beginning to recognize they're facing significant costs from their zero COVID policy, a very slow recovery. They're noticing that it is not just the US, this is many countries around the world for their own reasons adopting similar policies. And so they're starting to, China has 20% unemployment amongst youth, right? Private sector fixed asset investment, totally flat. Consumer confidence, very low. People very, their confidence of the system because of zero COVID's consequences, quite low. So they're facing huge challenges, right? We are too, as well, and we're not mainly because of China, but for other reasons. So I think but we don't want a war because of the catastrophic nature of it. So I think there's a little bit of sort of pragmatism going on, which is generating this increase in dialogue. Dialogue's not going to solve most of these problems. I think even when they sit down, they're mostly still talking about process. But I'd rather them be talking about process and very small incremental steps instead of what the trajectory that we had been on. There's a possibility that there will be a series of meetings and increased dialogue that will get us to APEC in mid-November in San Francisco, where we'll see the two leaders sit down. But as we know, something can come along and blow everything off course. It doesn't have to be a big balloon in the sky, but something else. So I just wake up each morning just wondering what I'm going to see that will do that. So this is as fragile a relationship as I've ever seen.
Can I just be real quick, and then I'll let you wrap us up? Because
I'm sorry.
Because you made a point that I wanted to make. I sort of forgot about it, and now you've reminded me again, which is we need to be clear-eyed in our estimation of the threat that China poses. I think we all can sit up here and say they are the largest threat to U.S. economic leadership, to our way of life, et cetera, et cetera. But let's not overstate how big of a threat it is, because they have so many of their own problems. And I think we're sort of, my old boss, General McMaster, always talked about strategic narcissism. We think it's all about us and how we are going to take action, and that's influencing them. And actually, if you look at the facts, most of the problems in China's economy, most of the things they're going through is self-inflicted, right? So on some level, we need a little bit less activity in the U.S. We need to stop coming at them every single way, left and right, and just let them sort of, write their own obituary. I mean, I think that in many respects, we are overreacting to the threat, and there are surgical, smart, strategic things we need to do. And I talked about my views today about what some of those could be, but we don't need to do absolutely everything all at once, because that will, I think, increase the chances of conflict, probably be counterproductive to our economy, and actually may not be as effective vis-a-vis China as just letting them do their own thing and sort of dragging themselves down. Because I think fundamentally our free market democratic policies are superior, and that if we let that play out over time, we are going to continue to be the preeminent power. So sorry, he made that sort of point elliptically, so I just wanted to sort of put a finer point on it. But
No, I'll just conclude with the carrot and sticks approach. And I think it's not just China. We cannot overreact to China, but we should not forget we have Russia, we have India, we have Middle East, we have Brazil with close links to China and critical goods from there. So on one hand, we have sent a very strong, important message to China by being multilateral with Europe and saying there is and G7 more broadly, there is a coalition among these countries. Yes, we could not pull in the so-called, I hate the name, but so-called global south to join us in sanctions against Russia, but at least here in G7, we are together. So this is a very important signal of unity to China. But also at the same time, we should not forget it's not just China. There are other countries we need to engage with, and maybe we should do more carrots, not only sticks. I'm not saying about Russia, but maybe India, maybe Brazil and others, in order to be able to, as you were pointing out, to invite them into our club positively, rather than just with threat of secondary sanctions.
Well, what a discussion. Thank you so much to our panelists today, and thanks for our audience for joining us. Please join me in thanking our panelists.